So let's have a conversation about depression. And depression is one of the most debilitating experiences we can have. And unfortunately, most of us as men, and especially as men of color, we don't want to talk about. And so it's difficult to describe depression because it's a feeling. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of feeling, and it's easy for us to slip into depression and not even recognize that we're in it. And so my experience with depression began back in 1989, and I had gone through a divorce, bankruptcy, foreclosure, basically lost everything. And so there I was, bankrupt and all alone and completely depressed. And I didn't even recognize that I was depressed. I didn't even know what depression was at the time. And so as my life continued to unravel, I noticed that I had a really difficult time concentrating at work. My thoughts were always going towards everything that was wrong. I had this feeling of sadness that I didn't really recognize. I had begun isolating myself, so I didn't have any contact with friends, family. I would go to work, come home, watch TV. Sometimes I couldn't sleep. I'd wake up two or three times a night. And my life was in complete chaos. And it was during the darkest period of my life that I guess you might want to call it a miracle, because I was sitting up late one night watching television, and there was this advertisement that came on TV, and it was about depression. And as I watched the commercial, I started to identify with some of the symptoms that they were talking about. Like I just mentioned, inability to sleep, isolating from friends and family, things like that. And so I began to recognize that that was probably what was wrong with me. And so I decided that I needed help. And it was the most difficult thing I'd ever done, because there was a part of me that felt like a complete failure. And I didn't want anybody to know that my life was in such chaos, because I had put on this image of having everything for so long and putting up this facade of Michael's got it all together. And I was trying to hide that, actually, that I was depressed, and didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to admit it to my friends. I definitely didn't admit it to my coworkers, because I was a manager, and as a manager, I'm the leader, if you will, and I didn't want to project the idea or let them see the leader as being weak. And so all these things just kind of played out in my head, but I realized that I needed help. I had to do something, because I had had fleeting thoughts of suicide. And as soon as you begin thinking those thoughts, then you're in trouble. And so fortunately for me, I watched this commercial, and I decided that, you know what? I am going to go to therapy, because I gotta fix this, whatever it is. And my saving grace actually were my kids, because when I had that thought about possibly taking my own life, my kids just kind of flashed in my head, and I said, there's no way that I could do that to my kids, that I could, take my own life, but most importantly, take myself out of their lives. There's a part of me that said, no, I just won't do that. And so after watching the commercial, I started doing some research on depression, learning a little bit more about it. And then I made the leap, and that leap was to actually go to therapy. And therapy was a unique experience, because the first time I went to a therapist's office, and I walk in, and I'm looking around the office, and there were some pamphlets and some brochures, and so I grabbed one of the brochures about depression, and this lady walked out, and she asked me if I needed some help, and I said, no, I'm just looking around. And the fact is, I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. So rather than talk to a therapist or make an appointment to see a therapist, I just grabbed some brochures and ran out, basically. And so I went home, and I was sweating bullets. I mean, I was so scared. I was like, man, I can't do this. I can't do this. And so a couple of days later, I said, I got to try again. So I went to a different therapist's office. I definitely didn't want to go back to the same one. I went to a therapist's office, and I did the same thing. I walked in, and I'm starting to look around, and the receptionist asked me if I needed some help, and I said, no, I just want to look at some of this stuff. And fortunately for me, there was a therapist that was there who must have noticed me or something, but she walked up to me and she said, hi, can I help you? And I said, well, I just want to get a little information about depression. And she asked me, she said, are you depressed? And I said, well, I'm not really sure. And she says, well, why don't you come into my office? And if you don't mind, let's just talk. And there was something about her that I trusted. And I followed her into her office, and she said, so tell me a little bit about what's going on. And so I'm sitting there in her office and literally sweating bullets. And she was just amazing, absolutely amazing. She picked up on everything. She knew that I needed help. She got it. And so she caringly just sort of coaxed me into having a conversation with her. And we started talking about some of the things that had happened in my life. Like I started sharing with her about my divorce and all of that. And she says, well, Mike, she says, you've been through a lot. And you've experienced a lot of loss. And so there's a reason that you may be feeling the way you feel because of all the things you've lost recently. And she says, when you lose things that you care about, it's natural to feel sadness, and sadness will lead to depression, and it sounds like that's where you are. And so I sat there and kind of listened to her, and she said, look, she says, I know that this is challenging. She says, but I know that I can help you. She says, if you're willing to work with me, she says, I know I can help you through this. And are you willing to allow me to help you through this? And so I took a deep breath, just kind of like I did just then. I just said, well, I said, yeah, I'm willing. And so the next thing that came up was, I said, well, I said I have a problem. I said, the problem is I really don't have a lot of money right now. And she says, Michael, don't worry about the money. She says, what you have to do is commit to getting better. And she says, we'll work out the details of the money if you're willing to commit to getting better. And I said, yeah, I'm ready. I'm really ready. And so I decided, I went home after speaking with her, and after speaking with her, I felt like I had taken this huge weight off my back. And my depression sort of lifted because all of a sudden I felt a sense of optimism that I was going to get better. There was a part of me that intuitively knew that I had taken a really important step, and I trusted her that she could help me. And so I decided to go back, and actually I was going once a week, so I went back the following week. And so I'm sitting in her office, and we're just talking about different things. And she said, Michael, she says, tell me a little bit about your childhood. And so I'm sitting there and I'm sharing some of the things that had happened in my childhood. And I had a really traumatic childhood, which I was in complete denial about at the time. And so I'm sharing all these things with her, some of the traumatic things that I went through. And during that time, I had this huge smile on my face. And she said, Michael, why are you smiling? She said, those things that you just shared with me, she says, they're terrible. They're horrible. I feel sad just listening to you. And my response was, well, I'm okay. And that's what denial does to you. When you're denying the hurt and the pain, we create these masks. And the mask that I wore for a very long time was, I'm okay. Everything's all right. And I hid behind that mask for many, many years. Well, as I was sitting there talking to her, sharing that information with her, and she asked me, why was I smiling? Well, again, that was my defense mechanism. That's how I didn't allow, or shall I say, kept myself from feeling the hurt, the pain that was inside of me. And so as we're sitting there, and she's sitting there, and she was actually crying as I was sharing the story of some of the things that I went through. And then she did something that changed everything for me. She looked at me and she said this. She said, "Michael, how would you feel if those same things happened to your son?" And when she said that, there's something in my mind that got me out of my head and into my heart, and I felt the sadness that I had been repressing for a very long time. And I thought about my son, and if something like that were to happen to him, it would literally break my heart. And I sat there, and when she said that and I started thinking about my son, I allowed myself to feel years of repressed pain. And all of a sudden I began to cry. And I felt hurt at a level that I had not felt in a very, very long time. And the flood of emotion that came through me, all the sadness, all the pain, just sort of poured out of me. And I allowed myself to feel it for just a couple of seconds. And then, in order not to feel that pain, I went into my head and I said, "What did you just do? How did you do that?" And the therapist said, "Michael, you have lots of unresolved emotional hurt that you need to release. And you can't figure this out. You've got to allow yourself to feel. The only way to heal it is to feel it. And so if you will commit to coming, I can help you heal that hurt that you've been carrying around for most of your life." And so I'm sitting there and I was completely confused, because my way of dealing with things was to think through it all. And in that moment, I couldn't think through the feeling, the hurt that I was feeling. And so I committed to continuing this process. And so I went back and we started working on healing a lot of the emotional trauma that I had went through as a kid. And this went on for several sessions. And I finally got to a place where I was able to let go of and heal that hurt from my childhood. And that hurt I had carried all of my life. And it was one of the reasons why all of my relationships didn't work. It was a reason that my marriage fell apart, because I had so much unresolved emotional baggage that it didn't allow me to connect with others. And that was the source of my depression. And so the good news is I committed to dealing with and addressing the emotional trauma that I went through, and I was able to heal that and move past it. And in doing so, it lifted my depression. It helped me get in touch with the real me. And I learned how to stop pretending and to be honest and open with myself and with others. And it's been an amazing journey. And so depression isn't a sign of weakness. Depression is simply a sign that you've been trying to be too strong for too long. And depression is just a defense mechanism to try to keep you from feeling some internal hurt that may be inside. And if you want to get through your depression, you've got to be willing to look within. You've got to be willing to heal your heart, to access the pain and the trauma that you may be holding on to. And again, it may be something that happened when you were 5, 6 years old. It's amazing how the mind and the heart works. And so as men of color especially, there's a stigma in our community about seeking support, seeking help. But I'm going to assert to you that right now, the most important thing I think you could ever do is to get in touch with your emotional well-being. And by looking at our depression, it can guide us to go in a little deeper to healing the hurt that may be causing or driving the depression. So if you're dealing with depression right now, know that there is help out there, but you've got to be courageous enough to go for it. And for a lot of people, the way we deal with depression is we try to anesthetize our pain by alcohol, drugs, sex, work, all of these things we do to try to anesthetize and not feel our hurt. And until we feel that hurt and heal that hurt, we'll never be happy or free. So recognize that depression is not a weakness. It's a sign that you've tried to be too strong for too long. So if you've been experiencing depression or deep feelings of sadness, there's help out there. You just have to be willing to go out and find it. So remember that the three most difficult words for most of us to say is "I need help." But know that there's no shame in that. So if you need help, go out and seek support that can help you move through whatever challenges you may be going through. Good luck.